55 to 70,000 years ago, our direct ancestors, the first true Homo sapiens, stepped beyond Africa and began the long, slow work of filling up the rest of the planet. Scientists gave this event a tidy label: out of Africa too, the second great migration out of the continent. It sounds like the defining journey of our species, the one moment that started everything. It isn't quite that simple. The history most of us were taught smooths over a far messier story. Even the name is a little misleading because modern humans didn't leave Africa once or even twice. They drifted out and sometimes drifted back in, over and over, across an enormous stretch of time. We know that somewhere around 130,000 years ago, our ancestors were already mixing with Neanderthal populations outside the continent. We've found human fossils beyond Africa that predate that mixing by a wide margin. And more than once, groups that had already left clearly turned around and wandered back in. To the people actually living through all this, there was no such thing as a continent, no invisible line called a border. There was only the next valley, the next river, the next stretch of ground worth trying to survive on. Science just needs a name to hang on a pattern, and so this particular wave of our own species heading out into the world became out of Africa too, which raises an obvious question. If this is Chapter 2, what happened in Chapter 1? When did it happen, and who actually made that first crossing? Go back further than modern humans, further than anything we'd recognize as fully us. Picture something else entirely. An older, more distant branch of our family tree, stepping out of the only home its kind had ever known and into a Eurasian landscape it had no way of understanding. New climate, new predators, new everything. Figuring out exactly when this happened, how many times it happened, and which hominins were responsible has kept archaeologists arguing for decades. To get anywhere close to an answer, we have to look at the oldest archaeological sites in Eurasia and read carefully what they're actually telling us. The story properly begins in the mid-1980s, in the last stumbling years of the Soviet Union. A team of archaeologists had been digging near a medieval cathedral in the small town of Dmanisi in southern Georgia. Rolling countryside, the kind of place that holds your attention without trying very hard. Their target was medieval history. Nothing more exotic than that. But as the crew dug into the cathedral's foundations and basement, they broke through into a far older layer of soil, and buried in it were the bones of long-extinct prehistoric animals. Then, in 1991, came the find that changed everything: the first hominin fossil. Over the following 3 decades, that same patch of ground gave up an extraordinary haul. 5 intact skulls, more than 50 hominin bones, roughly 15,000 worked stones, and close to 900 additional artifacts. Dmanisi is now considered one of the richest early Pleistocene sites anywhere on Earth, and the digging still hasn't stopped. There's no telling what else is sitting under that soil. What really turned heads, though, was the age. Using radiometric dating, measuring the slow, predictable decay of certain elements trapped in the surrounding volcanic layers, researchers pinned these fossils at somewhere between 1.77 and 1.85 million years old. That makes them, as far as anyone can currently confirm, the oldest hominin fossils ever found outside Africa, and it hands out of Africa, won its first solid piece of ground to stand on. Hominins were unmistakably beyond Africa's borders, at least 1.85 million years ago. The Dmanisi fossils were preserved well enough that we can say quite a lot about what these early travelers looked like and how they actually lived. The first surprise was their build. They were short and their brains were small, genuinely small, somewhere between 610 and 775 cubic centimeters, roughly half the size of yours or mine. That's smaller than the brains of the Homo erectus populations that later spread across Asia, smaller than Kenya's famous Turkana boy. In height, they stood around 1.5 meters, maybe 5 feet. not an especially large or imposing group of hominins by any measure. That detail sent a real jolt through the scientific community, because before Dmanisi, the working assumption in anthropology had been fairly rigid. Leaving Africa and spreading across Eurasia required something like the Homo erectus body plan, a big brain, long legs built for covering distance. Dmanisi quietly demolished that assumption. Small brains, it turned out, were no obstacle at all. Given the size of their brains, it's not exactly shocking that their tools were simple, the older one style, some of the most basic stone technology on record. You take a rock, strike it against another stone at the right angle, and a sharp flake shears off along a clean, curved fracture. It looks crude, but it's not accidental. Rocks don't break that way on their own out in nature. Someone sat there, again and again, learning exactly how hard to strike and at what angle, until the process became second nature. That's a taught skill, passed from one generation to the next, and it's a small but real hint that these hominins were already teaching each other things. Here's where Dmanisi gets genuinely interesting, though. Of the roughly 17,000 animal bones recovered from the site, every single one belonged to a Eurasian species. That one fact matters enormously, because for years, a popular theory held that early humans had simply followed African prey animals out of the continent without quite realizing it, trailing familiar meat into unfamiliar territory almost by accident. The Dmanisi evidence says otherwise. These hominins carried nothing more than the most basic tools, yet still worked out how to hunt and butcher entirely unfamiliar animals in an entirely unfamiliar world. They weren't tethered to the prey they already knew how to catch. Archaeologists estimate this population occupied the region for something on the order of 80,000 years, which tells us their presence wasn't some fragile, temporary foothold. It was stable, generation after generation, through cold Caucasus winters and the kind of environmental swings that would have tested any group without fire, without warm clothing, without anything we'd recognize as shelter beyond whatever the landscape offered. And underneath that stability sits what might be humanity's oldest and most defining trait: looking out for each other. Among the Dmanisi finds, one particular skull stands out from everything else. Catalogued as cranium D3444 paired with jawbone D3900, it belonged to someone who had lived to an advanced age and lost nearly every tooth in his head, with only a single fragment left in the jaw. Careful examination ruled out the obvious explanation. This wasn't decay from the fossilization process happening after death. The sockets where his teeth used to be had healed over naturally while he was still alive, smooth bone growing back over the gaps, which means he survived for a considerable stretch of time with no way to chew. Sit with that for a second. Almost 1.85 million years ago, with no fire reliably in use and no way to soften food by cooking it, chewing through raw meat, say from a hunted woolly rhinoceros, would have been demanding work even for someone with a full set of teeth. How does a toothless individual manage that at all, let alone survive long enough to grow old doing it? There's really only one plausible answer. The people around him helped. Perhaps someone chewed his food for him first, softening it before he ever tried to eat it himself. This single toothless skull is one of our oldest physical clues that hominins were already capable of real compassion, sharing what little they had, caring for someone who could no longer fend for himself, working together as an ordinary matter, of course, rather than an exception. That instinct for cooperation may be the single biggest reason our lineage eventually managed to cover the entire planet. Exactly what to call these people is still an open argument among specialists. Homo erectus, or something distinct entirely, Homo georgicus. Researchers may keep debating that label for years to come, but whatever name eventually wins out, the underlying fact doesn't shift. 1.85 million years ago, a population of small-brained hominins armed with the simplest of tools had already built a functioning, caring society outside Africa, in a landscape nothing like the one their ancestors evolved in. which leaves an obvious question hanging in the air. Were the people of Dmanisi really the first to make that crossing? Or had some other, even earlier group beaten them to it? Elsewhere on the planet, faint traces are surfacing that could push the timeline of that first departure back even further. To follow them, we need to travel about 9,000 kilometers from mainland Africa to the Indonesian island of Flores, and to a discovery that would end up dividing paleoanthropologists for years. In 2003, a team excavating a limestone cave called Liang Bua on Flores turned up something that became one of the most contested finds in the whole story of human evolution. A strange, tiny hominin given the formal name Homo floresiensis. Most people know it by its nickname, the Hobbit. The physical description alone is startling. Adults stood barely over a meter tall, around 3 feet, and weighed something like 30 kilograms. The brain case measured about 426 cubic centimeters, smaller even than the Dmanisi population, smaller than almost anything else on the entire human family tree. Naturally, this set off a fierce and, at times, genuinely bitter debate. Who were these tiny people, and where had they come from? 3 main explanations emerged. The first held that Homo floresiensis descended from Asian Homo erectus, a species well documented on neighboring Java. Even though no erectus fossils have ever turned up on Flores itself, and that isolation on a small island had gradually shrunk their bodies over many generations through a well-documented evolutionary process called island dwarfism. The logic behind it is straightforward. On a small island with limited food and few large predators, there's no advantage to staying big, and every advantage to needing fewer calories. Over enough generations, natural selection quietly favors the smaller individuals, and body size drifts downward. Flores itself hands us a second example of exactly this happening because the island also produced fossils of a pygmy relative of the elephant, a dwarfed stegodon that shrank through that very same process. So the idea that something similar happened to a population of hominins isn't far-fetched at all. The second explanation proposed that these were simply modern Homo sapiens, whose small size came from some genetic disorder or growth pathology. For a while, this idea had real defenders, and the argument grew heated in academic journals and conferences alike. It didn't survive close scientific scrutiny for long, though. Once more, skeletal material came out of the ground, and the anatomy simply didn't match any known human pathology closely enough. And the third explanation, the one that matters most for our purposes here, suggested something far more radical, that Homo floresiensis represented an entirely separate lineage, one that split off from some ancient African hominin group long before Homo erectus had even evolved. Trying to settle the question, researchers ran a major comparative study in 2017, measuring traits across a database of 133 different hominin fossils to work out where Homo floresiensis actually belonged on the family tree. The results opened up 2 genuinely striking possibilities. 1. Homo floresiensis might be a close sister lineage to Homo habilis, a species that's always been notoriously hard to pin down, slightly bigger-brained than Australopithecus but still short in stature, and still working with the same crude older one toolkit. If that's right, the roots of the Flores hominins reach all the way back to the very moment our genus first split away from its ape-like Australopithecus ancestors. 2. Homo floresiensis might belong to an older, more fundamental branch, one that eventually gave rise to Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, and Homo sapiens alike, meaning it split away before big brains had even begun evolving in any of our relatives. Whichever of those 2 turns out to be correct, one conclusion holds either way. Homo floresiensis broke away from the rest of the human family tree at an extraordinarily early point, at least 1.75 million years ago. And crucially, the evidence rules out the idea that they were simply a shrunken version of Homo erectus, and it rules out any close kinship with the Dmanisi population as well. In other words, this wasn't one single migration radiating outward from a single point. It was multiple separate waves of hominins leaving Africa, almost certainly unaware of one another, following different paths to different corners of the world. One wave ended up in the mountains of Georgia. A completely separate wave, at some earlier point, gave rise to the tiny people of a remote Indonesian island. Beyond their strange proportions, is there anywhere else on the planet holding traces of hominins this old? To find out, we have to turn toward Asia, specifically toward the vast, still not fully explored landmass of China, which holds one of the richest Lower Paleolithic records anywhere outside Africa. The oldest confirmed hominin fossil recovered in China to date is the Gongwangling skull, found in the Lantian region. Researchers classify it as Homo erectus, and radiometric dating places it at around 1.63 million years old. That's ancient by any reasonable standard, but it's still noticeably younger than the Dmanisi material. Archaeology, though, has a habit of rewriting its own timelines without warning, and that's exactly what happened, right in that same Lantian region, when researchers identified a separate site that pushed the story back much further still. Excavating nearby, archaeologists found an area showing signs of intermittent hominin presence spread across roughly 1 million years. Not one continuous settlement, but a place people kept returning to, on and off, across an almost unimaginable span of time. Strangely, this particular site produced no hominin bones whatsoever, so how could anyone be confident that people had actually been there? The answer is stone tools. Buried in the sediment were artifacts unmistakably shaped by human hands, and the oldest of them dates to a staggering 2.12 million years. A plain rock doesn't chip itself into a sharp, useful edge. Somebody sat there and struck it against another stone, deliberately, until it took that shape for a purpose. Whoever did that was, without question, some form of ancient hominin. No bones were needed. The tools alone are proof enough. Silent, but impossible to argue with. Think about what 2.12 million years actually means here. It's roughly 300,000 years earlier than Dmanisi, and it lines up almost exactly with the period when Homo habilis, or the very earliest members of our own genus, were first emerging back in Africa, and these particular tools don't look advanced at all. They're crude, unglamorous pieces, much like the older one tools found at Dmanisi, on Flores, and across the earliest African sites. What this tells us is remarkable. Long before the human brain had really begun its long climb toward its modern size, small, restless groups of hominins had already crossed out of Africa's edge and made their way all the way to China, working out how to shape stone into simple, useful tools for hunting, gathering food, and simply enduring an unfamiliar and often hostile world. Is China really the final chapter, though? Look at a map, and the answer seems unlikely. The nearest and most obvious corridor connecting Africa to the rest of Eurasia runs through the Middle East, through West Asia. If hominins had already reached China 2.12 million years ago, is it really plausible that nothing older exists sitting right at Africa's own doorstep? That question kept pulling archaeologists back toward that region, again and again. Jordan's rugged desert turned out to be holding an even bigger surprise. Geographically, Jordan and the wider Middle East sit as Africa's nearest neighbor, directly along the route out of the continent, so it made sense for researchers to expect the evidence there to be older still. That expectation turned out to be exactly right. Recent excavations across Jordanian archaeological sites have turned up Oldowan-style stone tools whose age, confirmed through radiometric dating and other geological methods, comes out to roughly 2.48 million years. Let that number sit for a moment. 2.48 million years ago. At that point, our own genus, Homo, had only just begun to exist. Australopithecus, the more ape-like hominins that came before us, were very likely still walking the same landscape, possibly crossing paths with these early toolmakers. Brains hadn't started expanding in any serious way. Fire wasn't a tool anyone had mastered yet. There were no spears, no advanced weapons, nothing beyond a sharpened edge of stone and whatever the body itself could do. And into that world, at that almost impossibly early moment, some of the very first, most basic hominins our genus ever produced had already stepped outside the borders of Africa and into what is now Jordan. The more fossils and sites archaeologists uncover, the more West Asia and the Middle East establish themselves as a genuinely pivotal region in the human evolutionary story. The old assumption pictured hominins leaving Africa and heading straight for distant continents in one deliberate outward push. Increasingly, researchers now think it worked differently. Because the Levant sits so close to Africa, hominins likely moved back and forth through the region constantly, almost as though Africa and West Asia together formed one continuous open range, rather than two separate landmasses divided by a hard boundary. Even so, a migration like this, roughly 2.5 million years ago, was never a simple undertaking. With small brains and fragile bodies, these hominins were constantly testing the edges of what they could survive. They were demonstrating again and again that no matter what nature threw at them, they could adapt to a new environment. No prior experience of what was safe to eat, no established knowledge of how to avoid becoming someone else's meal, and still they kept pushing forward, refusing to be stopped by any of it. Discoveries like these force us to reconsider just how capable our earliest ancestors really were, both physically and mentally. That sheer, stubborn will to keep going may be exactly what, much later, allowed modern humans to eventually claim the whole planet as their own. Here's something worth admitting outright. The real spark behind this entire piece didn't come from Georgia, China, or Jordan. It came from South Asia. To follow it properly, we need to travel to a place that, until fairly recently, most archaeologists barely paid attention to. A rugged stretch of hill country straddling the India-Nepal border, where a hidden chapter of human history has been sitting quietly underground. For the past several months, I've been buried in research on the ancient history of South Asia, and that work has meant talking with specialists from around the world. In one of those conversations, an Indian archaeologist named Gopesh Jha mentioned a site that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. He explained that, based on paleomagnetic dating, this particular site is extraordinarily old. That method works by reading the ancient magnetic signature locked into layers of rock and sediment. The Earth's magnetic field has flipped north and south, reversing many times over its history, at roughly known intervals, and each flip leaves a faint but permanent fingerprint in the minerals of newly formed rock. Match the fingerprint in a given layer to the right point in that known sequence of reversals, and you get a date. By that method, near Chandigarh, at the foot of the lower Shivalik hills, sits a locality called Masol, and the evidence recovered there, Gopesh told me, dates to at least 2.58 million years, quite possibly older still. If early African hominins were aiming to eventually reach places like Flores or Java, they really only had 3 plausible routes available to them. The first ran along Africa's coastline and down through South Asia's own coast toward Indonesia, and there's solid evidence supporting exactly this route. At a site called Atirampakam in South India, archaeologists have recovered stone tools dated to roughly 1.5 million years old. Which means that at almost precisely the moment one group of hominins was living out its generations at Dmanisi in Georgia, an entirely separate group was already making its way along the southern edge of the Indian subcontinent. The second possible route would have curved north around the Himalayan mountain range, but that icy, brutal, nearly impassable terrain would have made the journey close to impossible for hominins of this era. If some especially daring group did attempt it, their remains may well still be locked away somewhere under Himalayan ice, waiting to be found by someone someday. Given how many hominin fossils have already turned up in China, it's not out of the question that a group did eventually make it through by that northern path. The third route ran directly through the plains of what's now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, straight into Southeast Asia. It was this third route specifically that a joint team of French and Indian archaeologists set out to test when they began excavating at the foot of the Shivalik hills, along the India-Nepal border region. And what they found there is significant enough to warrant rewriting parts of the human story. Over the course of their excavation, the team recovered roughly 500 fossils from various animal species. Examining them closely, researchers noticed something odd. 3 of the bones carried fine but unmistakably distinct cut marks, the kind of marking left behind when meat is deliberately stripped away from bone, using a sharp edge rather than torn away by teeth. Could those marks have come from a predator's teeth instead? To rule that out, the researchers replicated similar marks using stone tools recovered from the same site, then examined both the ancient marks and the freshly made ones side by side under modern laboratory conditions. The conclusion was clear. These marks weren't left by teeth. They were made with stone tools by human hands. The leading theory is that the region experienced frequent ancient flooding and that early hominins scavenged the carcasses of animals killed in those floods, using sharp stone flakes to strip whatever meat they could recover before it spoiled or was claimed by something else. It's a fair question to ask whether 3 marked bones can really support a conclusion this significant. On its own, 3 bones might not sound like much, but the research team offered a genuinely compelling comparison. On the Indonesian island of Java, at sites where hominin presence spanning well over 1 million years is essentially beyond dispute, researchers have only ever recovered 5 cut-marked bones in total across decades of excavation. Set against that number, 3 bones from the Shivalik hills isn't a rounding error. Statistically, it holds real weight. Whether these particular marks were truly made by early hominins may remain debated for a while yet, and that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold. But it's worth remembering something important about these very first migrations out of Africa. They left behind almost nothing in the archaeological record. The people making these journeys were few in number, living the simplest of lives, with nothing resembling permanent architecture or settlement. Expecting grand ruins or the remains of an ancient city from this period is unrealistic. What we actually have to work with are small, quiet clues. A single worked stone, a faint cut mark preserved on an ancient bone. And from fragments this small, researchers are slowly piecing together an enormous sprawling map of our deep past. So where does all of this leave us? What can we actually say, with any real confidence, about Out of Africa 1? That first, much older migration out of the continent? First, the timing. The evidence from Jordan places it at a minimum of roughly 2.5 million years ago. And if the cut marks recovered from the Shivalik hills in India are eventually confirmed as genuinely hominin-made, the date could stretch back even further, closer to 2.6 million years. Second, who actually made that journey? Everything we've gathered points to small-brained, deeply archaic hominins, either the immediate ancestors of Homo erectus or its earliest possible members. Their brains measured somewhere between 1/3 and half the size of our own. Their tools were about as basic as stone technology gets, the same simple older one style found at every site along this trail. And yet, working within all of those limits, they adapted to hunting unfamiliar prey, endured the genuinely harsh cold of the Caucasus at Dmanisi, and eventually reached islands as remote as Flores, in the far southeastern corner of Asia. And there's one more thing worth carrying with you out of all this. That toothless elder at Dmanisi, the one who lived on for who knows how long without a single working tooth left in his head, is a reminder that these were not simply creatures scraping by on pure survival instinct. Someone chose to keep him fed. Someone chose to help him survive long after his own body could no longer manage the basics on its own. Whatever we end up calling these hominins, that single detail tells us they already understood something we still consider fundamentally human. That a group survives better than any individual ever could alone, and that caring for the ones who can't care for themselves isn't a weakness, it's a strategy that works, and it always has. These hominins turned out to be remarkably persistent. On Flores, cut off almost entirely from the rest of the world, a population of their distant descendants held on for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, all the way down to roughly 50,000 years ago. And that number lines up with one of the more striking coincidences in the entire human story. Around that same 50,000-year mark, modern humans, descendants of the later out of Africa II migration, finally reached that same island in their own long journey across the planet. And there, on a small stretch of Indonesian coastline, two branches of the human family that had split apart 1 million years earlier, maybe 2 million years earlier, found themselves face to face again. Sit with that for a moment. Somewhere between 1 and 2.5 million years ago, hominin populations broke away from a shared point of origin in Africa. Some stayed behind and eventually became us. Others scattered outward across the world, following routes we're only now starting to trace through stone tools and cut marks and healed-over jawbones. And then, after all that time apart, on one small island in Indonesia, distant branches of that same original family crossed paths again, without any way of knowing what they were actually looking at. If there's a single image that captures just how strange, tangled, and genuinely unlikely the story of human evolution really is, it might be this one, and the story isn't finished. Every year, new excavations and new dating techniques nudge this timeline around again, sometimes by a few thousand years, sometimes, as we've seen here, by hundreds of thousands. Somewhere out there, underground, in a stretch of hill country nobody has thought to dig yet, the next piece of this puzzle is probably still waiting.